Ancient psychological thought.
Even in ancient history, there was a need to understand the mind, the brain, and the workings of humankind. In fact, some of the first medical recordings in history will relate to the brain and behavior. People sought to understand how not only the body worked, but how to heal it as well. Around the world, it is possible to find all sorts of documentation on how psychology has developed, from Egypt to China and from Greece to India. The Edwin Smith Papyrus. Perhaps the most ancient known acknowledgement of the brain and how it worked is found in the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Named for the individual that bought it in the 1800s, this scroll is believed to date back to around 1600 BCE. In particular, this scroll described details on actively treating several different medical conditions and injuries that are important to understand. These not only include injuries and attempts to treat ailments, such as a gaping wound, but also information about the brain, the nerves, and how the injuries of certain types can create certain unintended side effects. In particular, it was discussed that brain injuries would impair both motor and sensory functions. This is relevant. It identifies the fact that the brain is responsible for controlling the body. Not only were the injuries noted, but also noted the first explanations that were ever recorded of the structures of the brain, as well as how to treat injuries and when to know not to. While this particular document did not explain much about behaviorism, it does create a foundation for the idea of psychology and the brain becoming a legitimate medical and therefore scientific field. The knowledge involved in this scroll was found to far exceed even Hippocrates, believed to be the founder of modern medicine, who lived 1,000 years after the penning of these scrolls. The first psychology experiment. Perhaps the beginning of psychological study, however, came with the experimentation of Lin Xie in the 6th century AD. This experiment sought to understand how vulnerable people were to being distracted, and in particular, they involved the active testing of several people to determine what they were capable of doing when distracted. In particular, Lin Xie had people drawing a square with one hand while actively drawing a circle with the other, in order to determine if they could control both sides of their body in different manners at the same time. While this does not provide much insight to us today, it is commonly believed to be the birth of the study of the mind and what humanity can do as an experimental science. Just as with the Edwin Smith Papyrus, then, this is important to recognize not for the contribution itself, but because it began to set the stage to understand psychology as a science, instead of as an aspect of philosophy. Moving forward in history, the next major acknowledgement of psychology could be seen in India's Vedanta. This was a series of Buddhist philosophical writing that acknowledged the sense of self. In particular, it addressed several concepts that anyone with even a little bit of psychology knowledge would recognize as common psychological keywords. In particular, the Vedanta addressed feelings of the mind in several ways. These were recognizing aggregates, emptiness, the non-self, and mindfulness. In particular, aggregates encompass the understanding of 5 distinct concepts. These were form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Form acknowledged the physical or material existence of anything, in particular in relation to the 4 elements of earth, water, fire, or wind. Sensation referred to any sort of sensory interaction with objects in ways that are either positive, negative, or neutral. Perception referred to the understanding of a sensory and mental process. Effectively, it allows for the recognition and labeling of something, such as the acknowledgement of the furry little quadrupedal animal in front of you is a cat, or that the plant next to you is the color green. Mental formations refer to the ability to create an understanding of activities. It is the idea of conditioning a feeling or action based upon the exposure to an object. Finally, Consciousness refers to an awareness of something around or in front of you, as well as an ability to understand its components. Abu Zayd Ahmed ibn al-Balkhi and the Psyche. As we move on from India into the Middle East, we meet a Persian scholar who was particularly interested in science and psychology. He was the first to introduce mental health and mental hygiene, treating them as a method to treat the soul. In particular, he penned Sustenance for Body and Soul, calling it a form of spiritual health. In his work, he described that physical and mental health are directly connected to each other, recognizing that spiritual and psychological health are intricately intertwined, and that doctors of the day would emphasize too much on the body without ever treating the mind as well. In particular, he asserted that because of the fact that people are both their soul, or mind, and body, it is important that they must both be healthy. In addition, he was certain that if the body gets sick, then the psyche loses its ability to function, referring to the fact that when you are sick physically, you usually feel exhausted, foggy, and unable to really properly function. If the psyche gets sick then, of course the body would also struggle, leading to physical responses to mental illnesses. Additionally, he was the first to recognize that there is a difference between neurosis and psychosis, asserting that neurosis is distressing but still allows for functioning, whereas psychosis involves a disconnect between reality and fantasy. He identified 4 distinct emotional disorders, which you may recognize as being quite similar to several of the more commonly known disorders of today. These were fear and anxiety, anger and aggression, sadness and depression, and obsession. When discussing depression, 3 types were considered: normal depression, endogenous depression that is a response to something physical, and clinical depression, which is more reactive. Al-Balkhi also was able to identify treatment for these sicknesses, such as talking through a loss, advising and counseling, and also internal manners, such as learning to develop other methods of thinking in order to help cope with them. Effectively, this was the first real step toward the psychology that you know today.